Hey everybody, I'm here to talk to you about chapters 27 and 28 in To Kill a Mockingbird. These are two of the most exciting chapters in the book in that they describe in the beginning of chapter 27 Bob Ewell's threatening behavior towards anybody associated with the trial, and then ending chapter 28 with Bob Ewell dying. And so let's talk about the transition between those two things. So at the beginning of chapter 27, we're told a couple of different things. We're told that Bob Ewell has gotten a job with the WPA and then quickly loses that job for laziness. The WPA was an association put together by the federal government during the Depression to give men jobs. They gave out thousands of jobs across the country and did a variety of different building projects. The fact that he was let go because of laziness, and the fact that he was one of the only people ever to lose a job with the WPA, again speaks to his Bob Ewell's general disposition. He goes back to collecting his check at the welfare office, and every time he picks up his check, he starts complaining that it was Atticus that got the job from him, that Atticus had somehow arranged to have him fired. So that's the first inkling that Bob Ewell is still holding a grudge against anybody associated with the case. We're then told that the judge in the case, Judge Taylor, was home one Sunday evening while his wife was at church, and he hears a noise, and he has the dog go out, he grabs his shotgun, and what ends up happening is that he realizes Bob Ewell has tried to break into his house. There's a cut on the screen and the door is swinging open. This is kind of a confusing paragraph in that we don't exactly know what Bob Ewell's motives were. Did he know the judge was home and was he out to hurt the judge? Did he think the judge wasn't at home and he simply wanted to steal things from the judge? Or did he simply want to scare the judge by making himself seen by the judge and then slinking off into the darkness? But the salient point is that he is confronting the judge in some way. The next person associated with the trial that Bob Ewell goes after is Helen Robinson, Tom Robinson's wife. We're told that Link Dees, if you remember in the trial, Link Dees is the man that stood up and tried to testify for Tom Robinson, saying he was one of the finest men that he'd ever met, and the judge had hammered his gavel and made him sit down. Well, the same Link Dees feels sorry for Helen Robinson, and so he gives her a job at his place. It says that he didn't really have a whole lot for her to do, but he felt sorry for her and felt that he had an obligation to give her a job. So he gives her this job, and then we find out that Bob Ewell has started to follow Helen Robinson to and from this job, just a little ways behind her, saying really awful, crude things as they walked along, basically trying to harass her back and forth from work. Link Dees hears about this and goes and confronts Bob Ewell. And he says on page 286, "First thing you can do, Ewell, is get your stinking carcass off my property. You're leaning on it, and I can't afford fresh paint for it. Second thing you can do is stay away from my cook, or I'll have you up for assault." And then Bob Ewell replies, "I ain't touched her, Link Dees, and ain't about to go with no person like that. You don't have to touch her. All you have to do is make her afraid. And if assault ain't enough to keep you locked up, well, I get you in on the ladies' law. So get out of my sight. If you don't think I mean it, just bother that girl again." Mr. Ewell evidently thought he meant it, for Helen reported no further trouble. "I don't like it, Atticus. I don't like it at all," was Aunt Alexandra's assessment of these events. "That man seems to have a permanent running grudge against everybody connected with that case." And so we are told that Bob Ewell has gone after the judge, that Bob Ewell has gone after the Helen Robinson, and we also know that he has threatened Atticus in the past, and so the logical assumption would be that Atticus would be one of the next people to be confronted. The rest of the chapter has to do with Halloween and a Halloween pageant that is being planned by Mrs. Merriweather and the ladies of the Missionary Society, basically because the children in the town have started to do some low-level vandalism. They break into a house and put all the furniture in the cellar and that type of stuff. And so the ladies say, well, we've got to do something about this. So they plan a Halloween pageant. We're told about the Halloween pageant near the end of the chapter when Scout says, I soon learned, however, that my services would be required on stage that evening. Miss Grace Merriweather had composed an original pageant entitled Macomb County, ad astra per aspera, and I was to be a ham. She thought it would be adorable if some of the children were costumed to represent the country's agricultural products. Cecil Jacobs would be dressed to look like a cow, Agnes Boone would make a lovely butterbean, another child would be a peanut, and on down the line until Mrs. Merriweather's imagination and the supply of children were exhausted. So the ham costume is important because that costume, which is made up of chicken wire covered with plaster Paris, kind of a cocoon around Scout, is going to become very important in the next chapter. That ham costume essentially saves her life. I think you could also look at the symbolism of this ham costume as a cocoon around Scout and think back to the roly-poly bug in the previous chapter when it was described that the roly-poly bug could defend itself or at least ward off an attack by curling up and not letting anybody in. And so the ham costume is going to be important. And then at the end of the chapter, we're left with this somewhat ominous sentence. Thus began our longest journey together. So we know that Jim is going to accompany Scout without Aunt Alexandra or Atticus. So they go to the pageant together, and this idea, this sort of ominous sentence that the two of them are going to make one of the longest journeys of their life has you wondering what's going to happen in chapter 28. Chapter 28 starts with a description of the pageant. The first thing that happens when Scout and Jim enter the schoolyard is that Cecil Jacobs jumps out and scares them. That sort of foreshadows what's going to happen as the chapter goes forward. We're then told about Cecil Jacobs and Scout going around and visiting different booths. They each have 30 cents to spend, and they're pretty excited about that. As we think about Scout and her transition to becoming a young woman, there is this hint of a romance between Cecil Jacobs and Scout. So they walk around the pageant, and then the pageant goes on stage, and Scout is embarrassed during the pageant because she ends up falling asleep when Mrs. Merriweather goes on and on and on with her narration, and she misses her cue and then comes out onto stage just at the highlight or the main ending of the pageant, interrupting Mrs. Merriweather and making everybody in the audience laugh, and Scout becomes very embarrassed by the situation. Quoting from near the end of the pageant, Mrs. Merriweather seemed to have a hit. Everybody was cheering, but she caught me backstage and told me I had ruined her pageant. She made me feel awful, but when Jim came to fetch me, he was sympathetic. He said he couldn't see my costume much from where he was sitting. How he could tell I was feeling bad under my costume, I don't know, but he said I did all right. I just came in a little late, that was all. Jim was becoming almost as good as Atticus at making you feel right when things went wrong. Almost. Not even Jim could make me go through that crowd, and he consented to wait backstage with me until the audience left. You want to take your costume off, Scout? He asked. Nah, I'll keep it on, I said. I could hide my mortification under it. You all want to ride home? Someone said. No, sir, thank you, I heard Jim say. It's just a little walk. Be careful of Haints, the voice said. Better still, tell the Haints to be careful of Scout. And so they're sort of like talking about a Halloween ghoul kind of person when they say be careful of Haints. Again, this foreshadows what's going to happen in the next couple of pages. It's important that Scout decides to keep the costume on. As I mentioned earlier, this costume is going to end up saving Scout's life, and so she keeps it on to hide the fact that she's very embarrassed by the way that she came onto the stage late, but the fact that she does keep it on is quite important to what happens after that. Then, near the end of the chapter, we get a description of an attack against the children. We know that the children have been walking through the dark, forested area between the school and the Radley household, and they hear somebody following them. Jim is becoming scared. Scout, again wearing this costume, is becoming scared. And then finally, the person who's following them ends up attacking them. And so it's a fairly long passage, but it's a very important passage in terms of what this crime is and what actually happened. So I'm quoting, "Shufflefoot had not stopped with us this time. His trousers swished softly and steadily. Then they stopped. He was running towards us with no child's steps. 'Run, Scout, run, run!' Jim screamed. I took one giant step and found myself reeling, my arms useless in the dark. I could not keep my balance. 'Jim, Jim, help me, Jim!' Something crushed the chicken wire around me. Metal ripped on metal and fell to the ground and rolled as far as I could, floundering to escape my wire prison. From somewhere near by came shuffling, kicking sounds. Sounds of shoes and flesh scraping dirt and roots. Someone rolled against me, and I felt Jim. He was up like lightning and pulled me with him. But though my head and shoulders were free, I was so entangled we didn't get very far. We were nearly to the road when I felt Jim's hand leave me, felt him jerk backwards to the ground, more scuffling, and there came a dull, crunching sound, and Jim screamed. So they've been attacked. Scout is knocked down. She's still wearing this costume. Jim attempts to pick her up and guide her towards the road, but somebody grabs Jim from behind, yanks him off of Scout, and then we're given the description, there came a dull, crunching sound, and Jim screamed. So we now know from the beginning of the book how Jim broke his arm. That dull, crunching sound is the sound of Jim's arm breaking. I quote further, "I ran in the direction of Jim's scream and sank into a flabby male stomach. Its owner said, 'Oof!' and tried to catch my arms, but they were tightly pinioned. His stomach was soft, but his arms were like steel. He slowly squeezed the breath out of me. I could not move. Suddenly he was jerked backwards and flung on the ground, almost carrying me with him. I thought, 'Jim's up.' One's mind works very slowly at times. Stunned, I stood there dumbly. The scuffling noises were dying. Someone was wheezed, and the night was still again. Still, but for a man breathing heavily and staggering. I thought he went to the tree and leaned against it. He coughed violently, a sobbing, bone-shaking cough. 'Jim?' There was no answer, but the man's heavy breathing. 'Jim?' Jim didn't answer. The man began moving around, as if searching for something. I heard him groan and pull something heavy along the ground. It was slowly coming to me that there were now 4 people under the tree. That's important. There's 4 people there. So there's Jim and Scout, there's the person that attacked Jim and Scout, and then there's another person involved in this struggle. Atticus? The man was walking heavily and unsteadily towards the road. I went to where I thought he had been and felt frantically along the ground, reaching out with my toes. Presently I touched someone. Jim? My toes touched trousers, a belt buckle, buttons, something I could not identify, a collar, and a face. A prickly stubble on the face told me it was not Jim's. I smelled stale whiskey. So a person is laying on the ground, identified as Bob Ewell through a couple of hints, the stubble on his face and the fact that this person laying on the ground smells like stale whiskey. Scout's description of what she touches, she says, I touched a belt buckle, buttons, something I could not identify, a collar, and a face. The object that she couldn't identify is the knife coming out of Bob Ewell's stomach. Somebody has stabbed him and killed him at that point. I made my way along in what I thought was the direction of the road. I was not sure because I had been turned around so many times, but I found it and looked down to the streetlight. A man was passing under it. The man was walking with the staccato steps of someone carrying a load too heavy for him. He was going around the corner. He was carrying Jim. Jim's arm was dangling crazily in front of him. That's the broken arm that's dangling at this odd angle. By the time I reached the corner, the man was crossing our front yard. Light from our front door framed Atticus for an instant. He ran down the steps, and together he and the man took Jim inside. So we've got this scuffle that happened underneath the tree. Jim and Scout are attacked by Bob Ewell. Then somebody attacks Bob Ewell and stabs him, and then grabs Jim, picks him up, and rushes him to the Finch household, where this person is met by Atticus. And so the description of this scuffle tells us that somebody has intervened and essentially saved the life of Jim and Scout by killing Bob Ewell. There's some talk in the house about calling the doctor and getting a hold of Hecate the sheriff, and everybody's running around trying to figure out what's going on. But the doctor does come, and finally Hecate comes. At the end of the chapter, we're left with this information from Hecate. Mr. Tate found his neck and rubbed it. Bob Ewell's lying on the ground under that tree down yonder with a kitchen knife stuck up under his ribs. He's dead, Mr. Finch. And so, again, chapters 27 and 28, 27 starts with Bob Ewell and this menacing, threatening behavior that he's exhibiting towards everybody associated with the trial. And then we end 28 with Bob Ewell attacking the children and then being stabbed to death. And whoever stabbed him is now taking Jim into his house, saving him and taking him back to Atticus. So again, an exciting 2 chapters. This is like the climax of the book where this action took place, and a resolution to that climax with the fact that we know Bob Ewell is now dead. The last 3 chapters in the novel have to do with the resolution. So what do we do now that the trial is over, Bob Ewell's dead, Tom Robinson's dead, and who was it that helped them under the tree? All of those things are resolved in the final 3 chapters of the book. I hope this has been helpful. Once again, if you have any questions, you can email me or see me in class. Thank you very much.